This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules, which together will comprise our lecture on Ned Block's article, The Troubles with Functionalism. Because of all the work we did in the first lecture, this lecture is actually going to be pretty short and sweet. I'm not going to focus on every detail in this article. Instead, I'm going to focus on its overall argument structure and the points that it's trying to make. So we'll start off talking about the two theoretical sins of liberalism and chauvinism. Then we'll talk about the two different types of functionalism that he sketches out for this paper. Functionalism with a capital F, or common sense functionalism, and psychofunctionalism. We'll look at the main thought experiment that drives this article, the homunculi head, or any of the absent qualia examples that he discusses for functionalism. And then I want to talk about his overarching structure, his overarching arguments path. And I'll differentiate it in three different ways because he switches back and forth between different ideas in a way that I think makes it a little difficult for students to follow. Let's turn our attention then to Block's thesis. Block tells us on page 268 and then reaffirms it really on page 296. He says, I shall argue that the troubles ascribed by functionalism to behaviorism and to physicalism infect identity, thesis, functionalism as well. I do not claim that this is a conclusive argument against functionalism. Rather, it is best construed as a burden of proof argument. In other words, for functionalists to get us to agree to their view, the burden of proof for justifying accepting their view really has fallen into their court. We don't have to tell them why we shouldn't believe it. They need to tell us why we should. So there are really two deadly sins that functionalists shame other theories with. On the one hand, functionalists ascribe liberalism to behaviorism because a system can manifest the behaviors used to verify a term or to ascribe a property, and yet fail to be an instance of that state. So for example, if properly medicated, I can feign pain when you kick me, even though I don't actually feel any pain. So a theory is too liberal if it can be used to ascribe some mental feature to some entity based upon the workings of the theory, despite the fact that that entity plausibly doesn't have that mental feature. So ascribes pain to someone despite the fact that they don't actually feel pain. Now, as Block notes, functionalists suppose that they're correct in diagnosing the source of behaviorism's liberalism. That is, it tries to tack down mentality at the periphery using physicalist language without any reference to inner causes. Functionalists ascribe chauvinism to reductionist physicalists because, they say, reductionist physicalists refuse to entertain the possibility of ascribing mental features to entities that don't have our particular constitution or that don't correspond to the type that they identify, regardless of whether or not those entities are plausibly candidates for those mental properties. So on the functionalist view, like, there's no contradiction in supposing that silicon-based life forms could feel pain, or that creatures that have a different functional psychology or a different physical constitution could have at least some of the mental states that we have. They diagnose the source of reductionist physicalism's chauvinism, and that it denies mentality to anything that doesn't have our same physical constitution. Now, interestingly enough, behaviorists can be accused of chauvinism as well. So if I paralyze you with curare and then I stab you in the leg with a knife, it's probably going to be a case of chauvinism if the logical behaviorist says, yeah, you're not screaming or anything. It looks like you don't feel pain right now. So behaviorists seem to be both too liberal in some cases and too chauvinistic in others. One final thing to note is that liberalism and chauvinism really reflect the way that functionalists and the Block, logical behaviorists, reductionists think about the theories that they associate with these mental terms or properties. They're definitional theories. They specify the individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions for being a pain, being a belief, being a desire, and hence they must capture all and only the cases of belief or pain or desire or ennui or schadenfreude. I don't mean this as a criticism, I just want to be clear about what I think the goal of these accounts are. So within this general framework then, Block will distinguish between two different versions of functionalism. On the one hand, we have functionalism with a capital F. This kind of functionalism is associated with Smart, with Armstrong, with Lewis, and with Shoemaker. Functionalists with that capital F hold that the theory of mind needed for functionalism is just the sort of theory of mind that we would get, say, a priori or through our common sense psychology without the need for extensive empirical investigation and refinement. Now, in contrast to that, Block identifies another version of functionalism, which he calls psychofunctionalism. Psychofunctionalism is associated with people like Fodor and Putnam and Harman, and it holds that functional analyses are substantive scientific hypotheses. I have to be honest, though, I'm not completely clear about how Block understands that statement or that definition of psychofunctionalism. At the very least, he understands it as including specifications of inputs and outputs that go beyond overt, common sense, easy to identify behaviors. We'll talk about that in the next lecture module.